and welcome to History Made Simply, your one-stop history hop back in time, where each week we'll be uncovering history's secrets for you. Make sure to like this episode and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for weekly History Made Simply episodes. On today's episode, we're exploring the life of the father of modern immunology, someone who's credited with saving more lives than any other man and is rightfully remembered as one of the BBC's 100 Greatest Britons. But what does this all have to do with cows, farm kids, cuckoos, and Napoleon Bonaparte of all people? Let's dive into the story of Dr. Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner came into the world on May 17th, 1749 in Berkeley, Gloucestershire, as the 8th of 9 children born to Reverend Stephen Jenner, the vicar of Berkeley, and his wife Sarah. Jenner went to school in Watton-under-Edge at Catherine Lady Berkeley's before moving on to Cirencester. However, in 1757, at the age of 8, little Edward was inoculated with smallpox, like thousands of other children throughout England. This procedure involved implanting a live pathogen sample under the skin of an otherwise healthy individual to promote immunity against any diseases caused by the pathogen in later life. But along with ensuring that Edward wouldn't succumb to smallpox, this experience, no doubt, left a lasting impression on the child and would spark a lifelong interest in medicine, with world-changing repercussions. Now, smallpox has been a problem for humanity since prehistoric times, appearing around the year 10,000 BC during the first agricultural settlements in northeastern Africa. Historians now believe that the disease spread from there to India throughout ancient Egyptian merchants, with the earliest evidence of skin lesions resembling those of smallpox found on the faces of mummies from the 18th and 20th dynasties, so from 1570 to 1085 BC. In fact, the mummified head of Pharaoh Ramses V, who met his end in 1156 BC, probably at the hands of this contagion, even bears the telltale signs of the virus. At the same time, though, smallpox was also encountered in ancient Asia, where it was described as early as 1122 BC in China before making its way to India. Smallpox finally reached Europe sometime between the 5th and 7th centuries, and frequent outbreaks of the disease are credited with the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire as a likely culprit behind the AD 165 plague of Antonine, which caused the deaths of over 7 million people, or about a tenth of the empire's total population at the time. Let's head back to 1763, southern Gloucestershire, when Edward was 14 and became an apprentice to George Harwick. He would work under Harwick for 7 years, gaining most of the experience needed to become a surgeon himself. By 21, Jenner transferred his training in surgery and anatomy to John Hunter at St George's Hospital, London. Sir William Ulster, a Canadian physician and one of the Big Four founding professors of Johns Hopkins Hospital, recorded that Hunter gave Jenner some much-needed advice. Don't think, try. Words he obviously took to heart, as Jenner's career would essentially amount to one big trial and error sequence, with varying degrees of success, as we shall see. In the interest of clarity, though, these impassioned words came from William Harvey, another English physician who also made influential strides in anatomy and physiology. Hunter and Jenner became incredibly close during the apprenticeship, and with good reason. Hailing from Scotland, John Hunter was one of the most distinguished scientists and surgeon of his day, and an early advocate of careful observation and the application of the Enlightenment period's scientific methods in the medical field, hence the advice to keep trying. The two would remain in dedicated correspondence over natural history for many years to come, with Hunter even nominating Jenner as a member of the Royal Society, Britain's leading academy of sciences to this day. Returning to his native countryside by 1773, Edward became a successful family doctor and surgeon, practicing mainly in his native Berkeley. There, he also indulged in other interests, studying geology and conducting experiments involving human blood. Another lifelong friend of Jenner's, physician Caleb Hillier Parry, possibly carried out the first flight of a hot air balloon in West Country, Britain. He launched a hydrogen balloon from the Crescent in Bath on January 10, 1784. It flew 19 miles, landing just west of Wells. Determined to attempt the experiment himself, Edward wrote to Parry, requesting him to join him in Berkeley, where our dedicated doctor launched his own crazed contraption of a balloon from the courtyard of Berkeley Castle at 2 p.m. on September 2nd of the same year. His flew 10 miles northeastward, landing in a field at Kingscote. As reported by the Gloucestershire Journal, it terrified the reapers so much that, for a while, they could not be persuaded to go near the thing. Jenner's hydrogen high ride resulted in his first meeting with Catherine Kingscote, who became his wife on March 6, 1788. Edward would relaunch the balloon from Kingscote Park, near Tetbury in Gloucestershire, owned by Catherine's father, Anthony Kingscote, for the benefit of the family and their friends. This inadvertently sparked one of the most romantic traditions as the balloon rose into the air carrying a poem, specially written by a poet friend of Jenner's and dedicated to Catherine, his newfound love. The couple had 3 children: Edward Robert, born in 1789, Robert Fitzharding in 1792, and Catherine, born 2 years later in 1794. The fate of the balloon is unknown, but there is a legend that it came to Earth a little over 20 miles away from Birdlip Hill, a little too on the nose, for reasons they'll make sense later, where there still exists a public house named Air Balloon Inn, in honour of yet another of Crackpot Doc's many escapades. By 1792, with 20 years' experience in general practice and surgery now under his belt, Jenner obtained a medical degree from the University of St Andrews, with John Hunter as one of his academic advisors. Jenner would continue to work among the rural farming communities, even turning down the opportunity to be onboarded as a naturalist in Captain James Cook's second expedition in 1772. He clearly felt more comfortable in his own surroundings in Gloucestershire. Nevertheless, where he would continue to treat patients and developed his knowledge of the natural world through diligent observation. Edward was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1788 following his publication of a careful study of the previously misunderstood life of the nested cuckoo, a study undertaken with considerable encouragement from John Hunter that combined the principles of observation, experimentation, and even dissection he so dutifully absorbed from his apprenticeship years. Cuckoos have long been known to invade the nests of other birds, but there was considerable dispute about how this was achieved. Was it the chicks or the adults? The proverbial egg before the fowl question. In the study, Jenner described how the newly hatched cuckoos pushed their host eggs and fledgling chicks out of the nest, thus removing competition for food and other resources, an opinion contrary to the existing belief that it was the adult cuckoos that were behind it. To confirm his theory, Edward demonstrated an anatomical adaptation for it. Baby cuckoos have a depression in their backs, which disappears after the first 12 days of life. That enables them to cup eggs and other chicks and throw them to their deaths, while the adults don't remain long enough near their infiltrated nest to perform this task. Jenner's findings were published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society to phenomenal praise, though some believed him to be a cuckoo himself to even dream this whole thing up and perform experiments to prove it. Total mad scientist vibes. Dr. Jenner's understanding of the cuckoo's behaviour was not entirely believed until the artist, Jemima Blackburn, another keen observer of bird life, saw a blind, newly hatched nestling pushing out a host egg on one of her many nature jaunts. Her independent descriptions and illustrations proved enough to convince the doubters, especially when none other than Charles Darwin himself revised a later edition of On the Origin of Species in response to these discoveries. You're probably wondering what animal experimentation has to do with smallpox inoculation, the thing Jenner has gone down in history for. But modern medicine was still in its early days, and back then the boundary between human and animal sciences wasn't so clear-cut. Moreover, it would be further experimentation with animals that would lead to Edward's most lauded contribution to modern society. Edward's interest in zoology played a huge role in his first experiments with inoculation. Not only did he have a profound understanding of human anatomy due to his medical background, but he also understood animal biology and its role in human, animal, or trans-species activity when it came to disease transmission. At the time, there was no way of knowing how important this connection would be to the history and discovery of inoculation and later vaccinations. Of course, we understand this connection now with the benefit of hindsight, and even today, many modern day vaccinations include animal parts from cows, rabbits, and chicken eggs, which can be attributed to the kooky cuckoo Jenner and his pioneering work on inoculation and vaccinations. So let's get to how cattle, cowpox, and Jenner's unbridled curiosity not only saved the lives of countless of his contemporaries, but billions of us still alive today. Given the ancient origins and widespread presence of smallpox were already covered, it's no surprise that inoculation against the disease was standard practice in traditional Asian and African medicine for thousands of years before coming to the attention of European physicians. But it was not without its risks. The insertion of live pathogenic material into the bodies of the healthy could potentially cause their demise from exposure to the said pathogens, or at the very least, make them contagious carriers with the ability to spread diseases to those around them while they remained infectious in the weeks following the procedure. Well, by the year 1768, English physician John Fuster, working out of Thornbury, Gloucestershire, and a close friend and professional colleague of Edward's, had realised that prior infection with cowpox actually rendered a person immune to smallpox. Cowpox is a mild viral infection of cows that causes a few weeping spots or poxes on the udders but little discomfort. Dairy maids occasionally caught cowpox from the cows. Talk about on-the-job hazards. Although they felt rather off colour for a few days and developed a small number of poxes, usually on the hand from milking the udders, the disease did not otherwise trouble them. In 1770, at least 5 investigators in Britain and Germany successfully tested on humans a rudimentary cowpox vaccine against smallpox. In this manner, Dorset farmer Benjamin Jesty, who had been infected with cowpox, attempted to confer immunity to his wife Elizabeth and their sons by infecting them with the dairy-borne disease when a smallpox epidemic struck the Yetterminster area in 1774. Jesty took his family to a cow that had the disease at a nearby farm and, using a darning needle, transferred pustular material from the cow by scratching their arms. The boys experienced mild local reactions and quickly recovered, but his wife's arm became severely inflamed, which for a time raised concerns about her condition. However, she too pulled through. This is where Cuckoo Jenner's countryside comforts paid off, as he was aware of these happenings and had long noticed these developments among the farm maids and had his own theories. Edward's interests in the protective effects of cowpox began during his apprenticeship with George Harwick all those years before, but it wasn't until 1796 that he made the first step in the arduous process whereby smallpox, who had long been in the scourge of humankind, would be totally eradicated. For many years, he had heard the tales of dairymaids being naturally protected from smallpox after having suffered from cowpox. In May 1796, Edward found a young dairymaid named Sarah Nelms who had fresh cowpox lesions on her hands and arms. On May 14, 1796, using matter from Nelms' lesions, he inoculated an 8-year-old farm boy, James Phipps, from his local Berkeley parish. Later, James developed a mild fever and discomfort, and 9 days after the procedure, he felt cold and lost his appetite. But on the 10th day, little James recovered. He next tested his hypotheses on a further 23 subjects, growing even more confident with each successful trial. So, Cuckoo Jenner now had his cure, and it was time to tell the world. In 1797, Jenner sent a missive to the Royal Society describing his experiment with young James. However, the paper was astonishingly rejected, a rather predictable habit it seems of this society, as it appears to need a lot of convincing. A year later, undaunted and after having added a few more cases to his initial experiment, Edward privately published a small booklet entitled, wait for it, An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Variolae Vaccinae, a disease discovered in some of the western counties of England, particularly Gloucestershire, and known by the name of cowpox. The Latin word for cow is vacca, and the one for cowpox is vaccinea, so Jenner decided to call this new procedure vaccination. In 1798, publication came out in 3 parts, and within it, he presented the hypothesis that infection with cowpox protects against subsequent infection with smallpox, made critical observations relevant to testing the hypotheses, and discussed at length, in his usual crackpot kooky way, the findings and a variety of issues related to smallpox. The publication of the inquiry was met with a mixed reaction with others in the medical community, which didn't stop Jenner from going to London in search of volunteers for vaccination to further prove his theory. After 3 months of probing, however, he found none. Nevertheless, vaccination was becoming popular in the city through the activities of Surgeon Henry Klein, to whom Edward had given samples of some of his new inoculants, having obviously been in possession of powers of persuasion beyond our good doctor. In 1799, other physicians began to prescribe vaccination for their patients, and Jenner was finally able to conduct a nationwide survey investigating resistance to smallpox, or to variolation among persons who had previously suffered from cowpox. The results of this survey confirmed this principle, and despite errors, many more controversies, and general cuckoo chicanery of it all, the use of vaccination spread rapidly in Britain, and by the year 1800 it had also reached most countries in Europe, even into France, a nation which had banned inoculation back in the 1720s. Reference in Voltaire's criticism of the ruling, published in his famous Letters on the English. By the turn of the century, Napoleon, who was currently at war with Britain, had all his troops vaccinated and even awarded Edward a medal in 1804. At Jenner's request, the French Emperor later released 2 British prisoners of war and permitted their return home. Napoleon remarked that he could not refuse anything to one of the greatest benefactors of mankind. Along with bagging Bonaparte's blessings, Edward was made physician extraordinaire to King George VI and received honorary degrees and tributes from other world leaders, including a ring from the Empress of Russia and a string and belt of wampum beads and a certificate of gratitude from the North American Indian chiefs. Although sometimes embarrassed by a lack of supply, Jenner sent his vaccine to all his medical acquaintances, as well as to anyone else who requested it. After introducing cowpox inoculation in their respective districts, many doctors encouraged the recipients to pass on the vaccine to others. Friend and colleague Dr. John Haygarth received the vaccine from Edward Jenner in 1800 and sent some of the material to Benjamin Waterhouse, a professor of physics at Harvard University. Waterhouse introduced vaccination to willing participants in New England and then managed to persuade President Thomas Jefferson to try in Virginia. Waterhouse received great support from Jefferson, who appointed him as the new vaccine agent in the National Vaccine Institute, an organization set up to implement an official national vaccination program in the United States. Despite all this, he continued his activities on behalf of the vaccination program, and vaccination gradually replaced variolation, which became prohibited in England in 1840. After a decade of being honoured and reviled equal measure, he gradually withdrew from public life and returned to the practice of country medicine in Berkeley. In 1810, his son, another Edward, died of tuberculosis. His sister Mary died the same year, and his sister Anne 2 years later. In 1815, his wife Catherine died of tuberculosis. Sorrows crowded in on him, and he withdrew even further from public life. In 1820, Jenner had a stroke from which he recovered. On January 23, 1823, he visited his last patient, a dying friend. The next morning, Edward failed to appear for breakfast. Later that day, he was found in his study, having died of another massive stroke in the early morning hours of Sunday, January the 26th, 1823. He was 73. He was buried in the family vault at the Church of St. Mary, Berkeley. Later, in the 19th century, it came to light that vaccination did not confer lifelong immunity, and that subsequent revaccination was necessary. The mortality from smallpox had declined, but the epidemic showed that the disease was still not under control. By the 1950s, several control measures were implemented and smallpox was eradicated in many areas in Europe and North America. The process of worldwide eradication of smallpox was set in motion when the World Health Assembly received a report in 1958 of the catastrophic consequences of smallpox in 63 countries. In 1967, a global campaign was begun under the guardianship of the World Health Organization and finally succeeded in the eradication of smallpox in 1977. On May 8, 1980, the World Health Assembly announced that the world was free of smallpox and recommended that all countries cease vaccination. The world and all its people have won freedom from smallpox, which was the most devastating disease sweeping in epidemic form through many countries since earliest times, leaving death, blindness, and disfigurement in its wake, all thanks to Cuckoo Jenner's tireless commitment to the never stop trying. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Edward Jenner, the Cuckoo Father of Modern Medicine, from History Made Simply. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and watch our next episode.